Hello there. This is just a bite-sized peek into our comprehensive back-end development course, and I'm all about sharing snippets like this on our YouTube free of charge, so sit back and enjoy the video. But if you're interested in diving deeper, why not consider a Covalence community membership for just $25 a month? It's your golden ticket to a full-stack learning experience, curating all of these videos into a comprehensive course, complete with lecture notes, reference sheets, and challenging labs that are really going to push your learning into overdrive. But the perks don't end there. You're going to unlock the keys to our front end and our React, or my React course as well. Not to mention you're going to have access to live Discord support, meaning you can harass me all you want, exclusive coding events, plus professional assistance for crafting killer portfolios and resumes. Just think of it as your personal coding toolkit, ready and waiting to help you build your future. So check the description down below for a link, and remember, whether you're here for a casual browse or a deep dive, just enjoy the video. Hello again, intrepid students. In the next walkthrough we got going on here, we're picking up where the last one left off, so hopefully you heeded my warning about not deleting code between these videos and are keeping up. So we had established a connection, talked about how to make a user for different versions of MySQL server and what library you're using. Since we're using MySQL2, we don't actually have to worry about authentication standards and things like that. Through some bumbling around, I eventually got us there. But yeah, like we have all this stuff written out. We have our schema, some users. We were getting them in console, logging them. And I said that we're going to continue on this path of just adding more features to this little walkthrough until we get to an Express API endpoint with multiple utility functions, separation of concern, do not repeat yourself tactics, all these abstractions of a data layer, which I would consider this our data layer, the code meant to interact with the database. We typically don't want to write this stuff, this kind of code, we don't want to write this directly inside of a router. Like in an API router, I would not want to see something like this where we'd have our code, all of this imported and put inside of that set of curly braces, because, well, that will make all of our routes incredibly cumbersome looking, have a lot of repeated error handling, have a lot of repeated code all over the place, when instead we can take all of this and wrap it in some kind of utility function with TypeScript to receive some additional support from there as well. It's nice to have a compiler that can help autocomplete properties on objects and array methods and things like that when they are needed. They're not always needed though, so I mean your mileage will definitely vary with TypeScript and selecting data. But nevertheless, I'm still going to take us there, but I'll take us there in a logical way of building it out ourselves together. That way, when you have to incorporate this into the boilerplate that you use for our full stack labs, moving on to full stack chirper and the full stack blog labs, for example, you will know what you're writing and where, and not just go, well, Luke did it that way, I'm going to copy it that way. I want you to understand the choices I make and know that they are not like the end all be all approach. Like there's a whole process that circumvents everything I'm showing you here called ORMs, or object relational maps, that, well, you give them the connection to the database, you tell them what your tables might look like, and they'll give you all the functions for selecting, joining data, inserting, updating, and deleting it without you actually having to write any actual DB code yourself. Those are great. I've used them on projects, but I would rather y'all know how to write this low-level stuff, so when you use something like an ORM or a query builder such as Knex, that's K-N-E-X, you will understand their purpose and why they've abstracted all this database and MySQL or Postgres code away and give you just JavaScript functions to do it, to call, instead of having to write any actual query code yourself. So we'll get there eventually. I don't think I'm going to cover ORMs in this part of the course. They're more something you can experiment with post-graduation. I'll be happy to give y'all ideas and projects for how to do that. But here, I'd rather y'all understand the fundamentals. So let's pick up where we left off and continue this after 3 minutes of saying let's pick up where we left off. So I want to add TypeScript to this and do some minor converting and see where it can help me and where it could possibly hinder me, because there are some caveats to worry about when working with all these types that MySQL2 will end up using, which it has its own built-in typing, so it should have its own typings available to us inside of this project, whether we're running it or not. But in order to actually use TypeScript, we have to do a few things. I'm going to go ahead and install TypeScript itself as a development dependency, because once it's compiled and put into like a dist folder or a distributed folder, for example, or a output folder, then we really don't need to have it as a regular dependency. So I'm going to choose to install it as a development dependency. And since I'll be using Node specifically and not TypeScript that's browser compatible, or yeah, because I'll be using Node code. I'm going to go ahead and install the typings for Node as well. So TypeScript knows how to help me autocomplete things like file system and path, which will inevitably make their way back into our code bases. So we'll have those installed right there. And like I said, we don't need to install typings or at types for MySQL2, as I'm pretty certain it comes with its own type library these days. I mean, we can always just test. I can see what happens if I install one of these. Let's try installing types MySQL2. If it comes with its own typings and it has one available, it'll tell us one is deprecated. So it says, oh, don't use these typings. Use the ones that are built into MySQL2 instead. It'll give us a deprecated warning. Or if MySQL2 was built with typings from the beginning, of course, I could just go check the documentation to tell this. But, this is a fun way to learn as well, the hard way. Yeah, it gave us a 404. It couldn't find it. So more than likely, it's installed with its own typings like I suspected. So that's a good indication that's working that way. We'll also need to, I don't want to have to sit here and compile and then run Node on a project. So out of laziness, I'm going to install a package also into development called ts-node. This will allow me to just inline transpile my TypeScript code into JavaScript and run it without having to compile it and then run the compiled code. It'll just put those two steps into one for simplicity's sake. So I'll go ahead and do that. And while I'm here, I'll go ahead and run npx tsc-init, which will initialize a ts config for this project to follow. There we go. Created that new ts config for us. And let's go change some things now that TypeScript has been added. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to convert this JS file to a TS file. Next, I'm going to go ahead and convert this statement from const MySQL to import MySQL. Instead of equals requires, I'll write from, and then I'll ditch the parentheses set, and boom, we now can use this safe, handy-dandy import statement. Now, it depends on also what my properties are here. I'm going to delete a lot of this comment stuff here as, y'all, oopsie doodles. All right, cool. I was like, I wonder what y'all caught on there. Hopefully it's nothing bad, nothing personal. So I made sure there's nothing weird in my start menu right there. Let's stop. Let's hit the hotkey on my keyboard to prevent that from opening again. I'm just removing all these stupid comments here. They're not stupid. I mean, they're plenty useful, but we don't need to be here for what we're doing here. We need to keep this as simple as possible, and there we go. I'm going to hit my format hotkey. Now, something I want to add here is I want to include a new lib property that also references the fact that I might be writing some next-level code. So ESNext is like the ECMAScript that will include some of the newest and craziest features of JavaScript and TypeScript and stuff like that. So if you're doing a lot of shorthanded code or array destructuring and things like that, I want to make sure that my default library is set in my environment for just the newest and greatest features that I want to be able to work with. So I'll go ahead and just include that there. Remember, our boilerplate will have a lot of the setup for you, so you don't have to do this step when completing the Chirper or Blog Labs, for example. Again, this is kind of like a fundamental bare bones way of getting this up and running, and for y'all to understand why we do things a certain way. Cool. Okay, so moving on, I edited our file extension. I messed with our ts config some and added a property to it, that ESNext, in terms of the lib array. In my package JSON, I will change this from test to dev, and I will change this to ts-node on db.ts. So once again, I could just run ts-node on db.ts. I don't have to compile the file, find the outputted file, and run node on that. Again, it just helps streamline that whole process. So let's make sure nothing's broken by now running npm run dev in my command line and confirming that it gets that array of users and it is good to go. So this is the array of users we were console logging at the end of the last walkthrough video. So there we go. We got our TypeScript added, and honestly, that's really about it. That's all you really have to do. There's not much we need to change on this sucker right here. So I mentioned in a previous video that you can streamline this whole connection process of getting a connection, establishing and getting a connection, executing and running a query of some kind, and then ending that connection with something called a pool, right? So I want y'all, like I said at the end of the last video, to know how a traditional handshake works in a database scenario, right, with our code in this case. And we're going to actually convert this to not a connection, but a pool, right? They help reduce the time we spend connecting to MySQL by reusing a previous connection, leaving them open instead of closing them when you're done with them, etc. So like, remember when I described it as thinking like you have, say, 10 lanes of traffic, and you as the director of those 10 lanes of traffic, each one represents a connection to the same database that wants to run various numbers of queries. We would have to be the director at these 10 lanes, saying, you go, your select statement, you go over here, you queue up over here, you queue up over here, you're done, get out of the way, next person come up. We can write all that code ourselves, which would be the logical extension of what we're doing here, but we don't want to have to worry about that on our side project or as newbies as we're learning as of yet. So keep in mind, that's what you would have to do if you're going to write all this stuff manually via connection. But if you want to save yourself the trouble of do that, if you want to save yourself all that trouble and just improve the latency of our queries and avoid all that overhead that comes with it, we're going to switch from a create connection instead to a create pool. And I'm going to go ahead and change this variable name from connection to pool like that. And I just hit the hotkey on my keyboard to highlight the variable, and I hit F2 on Windows. I don't know what the Mac equivalent is. I'm assuming it's something similar to that, but you can go to your right-click tooltip window and click on rename symbol to do that. So there we go. That makes it so the pool connection will now handle all that stuff for us, and it will leave it open expecting more queries rather than ending it like that. So just with that one change-up, let's make sure that we have not broken anything. We'll see that it hasn't released the connection like my connection.encode did a moment ago. That is, once again, there are a lot of defaults here where it'll allow for a max idle time before closing it, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's actually a whole host of new values, or properties rather, that you can provide this config object for pools. For example, I can provide a connection limit, which I think has a default value of probably 10. Yeah, default is a value of 10. So we have a connection limit that specifies, hey, maybe in development on my local machine, I don't mind using a bunch, but in my production, I don't want to pay for the massive bandwidth that tons of connections to a provisioned database might have. So I can limit the number of total connections. Or if a would-be hacker got a hold of it, they don't have free reign forever to just hold a connection hostage and run as much aggregation of data that they can find, right? So you can even have like how many connections are idling. So you can say that like, hey, I want a max idle connections, which is also a default of 10, I believe. Same as connection limit right there, where it says like, hey, the default, like how many idle connections can I have lingering around before I begin closing them and opening others and directing traffic in that example and whatnot, right? Like how long of a timeout do I want to have? How many queues do I want to have? How long I want to keep them alive? Like there's a whole bunch of new properties you can check out by going to the documentation of MySQL2. Just look up MySQL2 node docs or something like that. You'll either get their GitHub or their NPM registry, and it will have all the extra properties you can pass to create pool. But I'm going to leave it simple for here for now, again, to not confuse y'all. But know that there's a whole bunch of cool new things you could pass to create pool that, again, it helps remove that overhead of having to manage it yourself, and you just pass some options to it to handle that get connection, run query, end connection, while also maintaining the flow of traffic in 10 different lanes, keeping things moving along, saying, hey, that lane is super blocked, we're going to close it and use these 9 instead, open a 10th one on the right side, etc. Like all that overhead handled for us by a create pool, which is very, very nice. Now, next up, we need to discuss, what do we need to discuss actually? Well, yeah, so, I have this query right here, and it responds with a certain type. And as a matter of fact, now that I have TypeScript enabled, and this might have done it in vanilla JavaScript because of how my VS Code is set up, but now that I have TypeScript enabled, meaning it will import and use the typings from MySQL2 to determine this stuff, we can even see that it recognizes that this pool variable is of type MySQL pool. So it knows all the things a pool can do. For example, looking at query, we see all the union possible types and parameters and all this crazy stuff and all these values that results could possibly be. And again, this could be very annoying because, again, like the results of this query TypeScript has no way of determining what our query string actually is. It has no clue whether we're running a modification query, such as insert, update, or delete. It has no clue if we're running a select query that's a select star from users. It has no idea it might be selecting individual columns, such as ID and name. It has no idea that we alias a column name to as username. It might have no idea we're grabbing like some kind of max age calculation that we're going to alias as another column name. It has no idea we're doing all that kind of stuff from a string, which is why you'll see these typical responses here as a union of like 50 different possible types, which again it's useful to a veteran TS developer to know these kinds of things, but to, let's say, a newbie just getting into TypeScript and learning how it's going to work and help us. And then, like I've talked about in my previous videos, where it's like a spectrum of choices and options you can have of how you need to write and define every nitty-gritty bit of code to, I just want some autocomplete support, my guy. And we're gonna lean towards the lighter side in the TypeScript of this particular part of the course for this, because again, like, your mileage will vary based on what you need it and want it to do. So that being said, calling this code inside of an API route is not what we're going to want to do. We're going to want a separation of concern. I want a function that's going to help me streamline the calling of my statements. I want a function that will properly give me the results. Like, results we know is a select star from users, meaning it would look like this: an array of objects that have properties ID, name, email created at, possibly depending on what we select. But if I wanted to get the name of the first person in the array, I would need to write index0.name, and we know that code is going to be just fine in the sense that we know we get an array. Index 0 would be the first user, this object of Mario. So this code should run just fine if I just tell TS to ignore it. So I'll say TS ignore the error down here for right now. Stop and restart our project here. I'm going to go ahead and tell it to do so. And we got Mario. So we know the output is correct. But once again, TypeScript doesn't know that out of our possible results from the select statement here, it's not entirely sure what it ended up getting. So we have to account for a couple of different things in our code base, right? We need to make sure that we know what's going on here. So yeah, you will see different things online as well. Hold on. You'll see different implementations online. You might have seen something akin to this as well. You might see a pool.execute. Yeah, that's not really happy about that at all. There we go. Yeah, so it looks like execute has less possible options, which is nice to know. But you might see this as well on various Reddit posts or Reddit threads, Stack Overflow, comment threads and things like that, or maybe some blog posts or other YouTube videos where you see individuals use execute. Execute is not distinct to pools. A regular connection can also run execute versus query. Out of curiosity, does it show much of a difference? I think it had additional metadata. Oh, it doesn't. Interesting. Still an array of objects. But yeah, execute is a little bit different from query. They have some differences. But thankfully, with a lot of these modern packages, you don't need to worry about one or the other as long as you're escaping things, which I'll be talking about in a separate video, meaning how do we prevent ourselves from getting injected a la Bobby Tables. That joke will make sense when I get there, unless you're just already an XKCD fan and know Bobby Tables, and leave a comment in Gravity. But yeah, so execute and query both do the same thing, right? They are both meant to execute a SQL query, obviously. But query is going to be used for any SQL query. It directly sends the SQL query as a whole string to the MySQL server, ready to be just straight up executed. I don't mean killed, I mean ran, right? Executed. Like, it'd be taking this string, copying it, and pasting it directly to our server here to run it. That's what a .query does, right? It sends it directly to our server, meaning it can potentially expose us to what are called SQL injection attacks. Again, I'll cover that in another walkthrough video, so y'all don't make the newbiest of newbie mistakes and get your projects hacked by me or my co-instructors here, such as Andrew. We'll be happily do that. Execute is a little bit different in that it is used for prepared statements. It separates the SQL query and any placeholders we're going to pass later. So we're going to be focusing on execute because of its inherent benefits and to make sure that y'all write stronger code. But know that query is fine to use. Even if you are using escape values, it'll work the same way. You'll even see older videos that I've done using query where I decided not to comment on the differences between them, but I get asked this occasionally. So yeah, query and execute, they do inherently the same thing in two different ways. Query just sends a string on over to the server. Execute will prepare it first and send the string value itself, then the escape values, and they'll be handled by the server whether it gets executed or not. And it helps prevent you from getting breached or injected, which again we'll talk about later. But for now, we're going to focus on execute instead of query for these possible results. So once again, we probably want to know and tell SQL, hey, or not SQL, but TypeScript, hey, this results will be an array of potential users, right? Of potential users that I might want some TypeScript support autocomplete on. Because like I said, if I wanted to get Mario, we would write index0.name, which by itself is not good enough for TypeScript to know how to help us. It doesn't know that name is a property somewhere on our users table. And we have a couple different ways we could potentially do this, right? So what would I want to show y'all first to get it done that way? So your first inclination, and what you'll see me do a lot as well as Andrew, is typically write a custom interface, maybe called iUserRow. This will represent an individual row in the database represented by a JavaScript object. So I'll say, hey, this interface of iUserRow will have our users that have an ID of number, a name string, an email string, and a created at string. I'm not going to call it a date because I tend to like my database stuff come back as strings and let my code handle the parsing of date times and things like that. But yeah, this is just, again, one of our individual users. ID, name, email, created at, and is calling them all strings except for IDs, which we know are numbers. So that is what our interface would look like for an individual user. Now, we see here that in results, we get a specific type when we look at this parameter results. OK packets. OK packets are deprecated in MySQL2. We're not going to talk about that. The new one is called the result set header. The result set header is what we're going to see on insert, updates, and deletes. It was in the previous video when I talked about that object that had like affected rows changed, insert ID, stuff like that. And I said that all selects come back as arrays of objects. We have our object, and so we would tell SQL or TypeScript that this object array is what's going to be returning from this select statement, whether it's one, many, or none. It'll be an array of those possibles, right? So they call that a row data packet, and they call the insert one a result set header. So what I'm going to do up here in my import statement. I'll do it this way. I'll say import the type from MySQL2 typings, and I want the result set header, and I also want a row data packet. These are the two types that are going to help us tell TypeScript exactly what we intend to do down here. So I believe we can just take this interface iUserRow and say it extends exactly what a row data packet happens to be. And I think that we can actually take this interface iUserRow and write extends row data packet. So now we can tell our TypeScript interface that, hey, it is going to be a row of these columns that will extend the row data packet type. So now we kind of have merged the two types together. So we can tell TypeScript that this connection, this query string should execute and get us what we can define as a list of users. Oh my goodness, I can't type. Users, which will be results as iUserRow array. And if I just do this right here, this type assertion that say, hey, results will be interpreted as an iUserRow array, it knows that that's what users is, which means down yonder, I could write users 0 dot and now start receiving potential TypeScript support on our types, which I think is important to know how to do. So that right there should give us a console log that should be friendly. That should be friendly for Mario. There we go. And now that we also know that users is an array, I should also be able to do a users dot. There's an autocomplete for each user. I want you to take in console log the user dot and voila, their email address, for example. And see all that autocomplete I just got from TypeScript and IntelliSense? That is what I am talking about when it's nice to have some TypeScript support when dealing with when dealing with this information here. So, your mileage will vary because what happens if I have a secondary table, right? If I had a secondary table and I join that secondary table into this query, it is no longer just this one interface. Let's pretend I had an interface called iProducts row. Like, let's say we had that. This is a hypothetical I'm working with. Now it's technically the intersect of both an iUser row and an iProducts row combined together. So I'd have to make a type called iUser products join or something like that that would be a intersect of iUser row and iUser product. And then all of a sudden we have to start doing that. But what happens if, again, I do a partial select and alias stuff inside of there, inside of the join? It gets messy fast. So a lot of the times the recommendation is when you're first starting out, I recommend y'all do something akin to this. That is because it will help you know the correspondence of what code you're writing with a little bit of autocomplete help and support down here, right? But once you start doing more and more complex queries that involve especially one or more joins, especially if they have any kind of aggregate functions or calculations and aliasing happening in your select statements, you're honestly just better off writing an individual interface that represents and is sculpted against the data you're going to be finally getting from this select statement. So when you are starting out with nice and simple stuff, this approach is totally fine and will help you out. As a matter of fact, there's actually a caveat to this one I want to show y'all. But the more complex your query gets, the better off you're going to be just having this written in case someone needs it, like a developer wants to know, like maybe they don't know SQL, but they come in here and they see this interface that represents what's coming back from SQL. And like, I may not know SQL, but I know TypeScript, and I can read this and help you figure out what's going on, right? So it's still useful, not as I hate the term self-documenting code, but it is useful in that regard. So from there, we can take this and also theoretically write, I think, partial on this down here to say it is a partial. It's possibly undefined, yeah, because email noun might not exist. The point being, we do this because we are not entirely sure what our select statement up here is aliasing and selecting. So even though these properties exist on all users, I have to tell TypeScript, hey, I may not be selecting every single property from the iUser row interface, right? It's telling TypeScript all these properties, ID, name, email, created at, they're all optional. And we could go in here and add a question mark to each property to signify to TypeScript these are potentially not selected properties. I could also just come down yonder and say, hey, this is going to be a partial of an iUser row array, meaning it, well, actually no, because partial will be the array part, and I want to make sure it's the iUser part. So what it would be, to write it differently, I would write array I of a partial of an iUser row. There we go. And does that get rid of the? Yeah, okay. So that's actually what I meant to do. My bad. It is an array type of partial iUser rows because the array will always be selected. Remember, it always. I just moved the array to the outside of the diamond brackets. Oh, that's ridiculous. I wish I didn't know I could do it that way. I learned something new. Yeah, so that's the type. It means that we're always going to have an array. That array, however, can be made up of objects that may be one or none or some of these properties. And again, once we get into aliasing and stuff like that, all this really begins to just suck. That's why I'm saying your mileage will definitely vary depending on what you want your TypeScript code to help you with. Remember, it's a spectrum. I want it to give me some autocomplete support, at least for array help and some properties and stuff like that, but it may not necessarily need to. So, wanted that for some food for thought. And again, this type will be completely different for insert, update, delete statements. So, let's talk about actually making some utility code, right? So, I like to write utility functions that separate this crap out and give me an easier way to call my code. Let's go ahead and do that by modifying what we got here. I'm going to write an async function called select query. Okay? It will be provided a type of some kind because this select statement might select from different kinds of tables. So I might say I will pass it a query string as its parameter, and I'm going to say it should return a promise of type T array. Yeah, that works for now, I believe. And we're going to say const results equals await pool dot execute our query string. And I want you to return our results, and we're going to assert that it's going to be a T array type no matter what. So first off, we have a couple issues here in terms of what's going on. It's saying that the await signature is not usable on pool.execute. Well, we just saw a moment ago with the code I had, pool execute. I should have left it there. Pool execute has a callback function. It does not have a promise syntax. So while I could take the time to write the following, back. Okay. I could take the time to write the following, or I could have this return a new JavaScript promise. This is what you had to do with the old MySQL code library, where you'd have to return a promise that would handle the resolving and rejecting. Well, thankfully for us, MySQL2 simply has a promise version of all this code here, which means we can come down yonder and go, oh my goodness. I keep undoing and redoing stuff in the incorrect order. We can convert this to a / promise like that. And voila, we have a much nicer bit of code to look at here. So I'm so thankful that MySQL2 just uses the native promise API available in JavaScript now, and it has this / promise import statement you could swap to in order to then simply call and use our promises. This is much, much, much nicer here. But now our return statement is saying that we have some properties that might be missing off of here. I don't need to do that. Let's just return results directly here. Oh, because it's, okay, hold on. I don't know if it's going to like that. Of course not. I just want it to run, and I'll fix the typings for it later. Anu? Okay, cool. Okay, so I just want it to run. I don't really care what we use it here for. So I was just making it TypeScript friendly to just run and not tell me there's an error. So now let's see. And look, we take the time to do this, which means I can now run something like this, where I can say select star from users. Then users console log users dot catch e console log e. Now you notice here I'm not going to include a try catch up here for error handling. I just want this will throw an error if it has one, and we're going to actually handle the error from our Express API endpoints in a more consistent and logical fashion. Because this is just a utility function. It shouldn't dictate how errors are properly handled. I'm going to have it throw its own error, and the error will get daisy chained until it will bubble up in the system process until something catches it. And that something will be our Express API endpoints eventually. I just want to make sure that it currently runs just fine with our utility function, which it does. But we can see here that the promise library has a couple of additional things compared to the callback syntax, right? It has, the structure is an array of arrays, right? So it's an array. The first element is array 0, which is my list of users. And then array 1 is another array that shows my table's information. This is actually another argument that you will see in even the callback syntax. Going back to callback, look like this. Blah, we could do 1 + 1, which will get us the result value of 2. But remember we had error results and then our code for this simple query execution down here. What is it? Did I forget something? I don't think so. What am I forgetting? Results is declared but never read. Is it because I never use it? Yeah, pool.query. Oh goodness, y'all. What am I missing here? This callback syntax. Hold on. Oh, that's right. It's because I imported the promise syntax, so I don't have that available down here. Whoops, it doesn't know what this syntax is. The point being, if I did have it imported, there's a third parameter I didn't cover called fields that represents some metadata information about the rows or table it's selected from. That is what we're seeing here in this highlighted bit in my terminal here. This second part is called fields. So we're going to go up yonder and just destructure the first element. So it would look like that if you needed the fields property, but because we don't, I'll destructure it as such and rerun it, and boom, we're back to my simple array of objects that represent all possible selected users. So from there, I can now, for example, take my results and say, hey, it'll be a promise of T array. And I'm just going to type assert this to say this will be a T array, no problem, unless an error happens, in which case I'll handle that when I get there. But this makes it so I can now pass a type to here where I can say this will be a partial type of iUser row, like that. And this partial allows me once again to know that users is an array method that could do things like .map or .forEach or .filter. Or if I did user square bracket 0, my partials are right there for all possible selected properties. Again, this will not work if I begin aliasing column names. But yeah, that gives us the ability to do that right there, which I think is pretty darn cool. And I guess instead of having to write partial every single time, you could always... It's going to get real nasty looking. There we go. And that way I could just pass the iUser row into this select query over yonder in order for it to know what all we got going on inside of our query. Is much cleaner looking. So again, we have a utility query for select statements. So why write one for select statements? Again, separation of concern. I don't want to have to also know that this one just runs select statements. I can pass it iUser row and call it a day. Now, for modifying statements, I know they're always going to respond with that object of affected rows, insert ID, changed rows, all that kind of fun stuff. So that's a results setter type. So I'm going to write another one called async function modify query. It'll take no type because it's always going to return the same kind, same arg, query string. Return type will be a promise that returns a result set header every single time. Const, we don't care about the fields thing again. Const results equals await pool.execute, the query string, and then it's going to return results. And in case something goes wrong or awry, I'm going to say it's always going to be as type results set header. I'm going to assert that right there. And that will now allow me to go from running this select statement to, for example, a modify query. Update users, set name equals updated, where ID equals 13. That should allow me to now update that 13th user. Let's go select star from users. Yeah, test. I want this to say updated instead of test, which is what I'm doing here. And just like before, I'll say .then. This will be that result header. Let's console log it and take a look at it. And we're going to catch an error and log the error in case something ends up happening down yonder with this query. So let's go ahead and run it. Take a look at it. Whoopsie. Save and rerun. There's our result set header. Affected rows 1, that means it matched a row and updated something. So I'm going to go back and comment this one out, comment my select back in to execute it and take a look at it. So we're going to stop, restart. And yay, we got updated for name ID of 13. As we can see, modify query is for insert, update, delete statements, and select query, as its name suggests, is for selects. Now, in the past, I've combined them into one utility and simply run them with type checks and if-else statements to determine what kind is going to be returned. But I found for newbie students, this is easier to think about, and it begins preparing you, for big real-world projects where you're going to have multiple connections from multiple, separations of concern. This connection is just for selects. This connection is just for inserts, updates, deletes, etc. So there you go. That is how we can add TypeScript to this whole mess to try and attempt to clean things up and give us some TypeScript support. With, again, your mileage will vary because once we start doing all these crazy partials and column aliasing and join statements, it ends up becoming very messy looking and not exactly the most useful to us. So the mileage part will vary about how much help you're really going to get from TypeScript when you begin doing complex queries. But when you're first starting out, it makes you write stronger code and know what is associated with what and what goes where. I personally believe. So that's the way we're going to do it for our walkthroughs in our labs. And then finally, I still don't even want to run this inside of an API endpoint. I still want another abstraction away from writing any kind of SQL code in an API endpoint. They need to be completely separated. API endpoints are what I would call the networking layer. These queries are called the data layer. That's like mixing oil and water, right? We don't want to do that. Instead, we're going to be writing utilities, even around stuff like this, to give us much easier things to call. What do I mean by that? So let me show you. I can write now a function, and we're going to call it getAllUsers. It'll take no parameters, and it's going to return a call to select query. It's just going to return this, honestly. It's going to return my select query just like that with those properties, right? So why take the time to even do this, my guy? Again, it'll give us an easier way to call our code. Let me just put this in here for laziness. It'll just give us an even easier way of referencing our code and keeping the database stuff completely away from the API endpoint. That right there, I am fine with y'all putting into an API endpoint, like a get request to API users that runs this code. If I need to change the query, I head to my database layer, wherever this happens to be, probably in its own file and folder that we're going to be importing in. Like maybe we're going to add this to an object called DB users, and then we'll have get all users as a property. Meaning we'll have a much better way of calling it. We'd have like db.users dot, and maybe we'll put like get all like that. So we'll have a get all db.users.getAll runs this code in an API endpoint, right? And once again, it knows it is a partial potential of iUser row array, and so we have at least some TypeScript IntelliSense support giving us a hand in auto-completing and doing array methods and stuff like that. So that's enough for this walkthrough. I know it was a lot just to add TypeScript, and again, the TypeScript confusion tends to come in. How much do I really need? Again, I don't recommend you add a bunch of any's anywhere, but if that's what you have to do to get it working, and then over time add more TypeScript help, go for it. But eventually, the next video will be adding Express and eventually moving some things out into separate folders and actually running it that way, and then eventually adding it to our boilerplate and showing you how I organize it there as my personal recommendation. So I'll see y'all in the next videos.